is Michael from Expanse VR, and this is the first in my brand new first-person shooter series for Unity 2021. That's right, we're heading into the new year, and the new Unity is out, well, in its alpha stage. And in this series, we're going to start you right from the beginning, all the way up to shooting, killing, picking up weapons, and doing complete full stage. So let's jump right into it. And if you're new to the channel, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and of course click that notification button down below to make sure you are notified whenever I post a new tutorial for you. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is start up a new project. We're going to go with the universal render pipeline, and we're going to rename this to Unity 2021 FPS tutorial. Click create, and we just wait for it to load in. So as you can see, with the 2021 alpha loaded up, it's pretty much identical to 2020 and the latest releases of 19.4 LTS. So whether you're using the LTS 2020, you can follow along just fine with this, with a small few little tweaks here and there. With my layout, I do have it set up slightly different to how some other people would, not the standard one. So if we go to layouts, and we look at default, this is normally what you would see when you load up, but for me, I like to switch things around because it gives me a lot more area to play with. So this is my professional, what I call my professional layout. All I've done is I've just mixed it up so the hierarchy's over here, my project window's here, and then it's split between these two here, which will change this to full HD for the moment. So the first thing we need to do, as I always do, is just to clean up a few things in here. First off, we're actually going to just bring in the first asset that we're going to use, which is a free one. So this is the Snaps prototype. Snaps is an asset that you can use in Unity, and they have a few different prototype scenes. This one's perfect for us to actually have a go with it. If you are using 2020 and 2021, do things slightly different with the asset import. So you need to come into the asset one here, choose to open in Unity, and it's actually going to bring it in through the package manager now. So this is the only thing that's slightly different if you're using 2019, that you can actually just still bring it through the asset store tab. And just a small caveat here that the package manager in 2021 at the moment can be very slow. So a couple of refreshes later, here it is, and we simply just import it in. Cool, so we just close this down. So we just come down here to the asset store originals, Snaps prototype, sci-fi industrial, sample scenes, the sample layout. Now when you first load it, of course, you're going to see the pink material of death, which just means that there's an error with the materials, actually with the shader in fact, just letting you know that it actually hasn't been upgraded to the universal render pipeline. And all we need to do is go edit, render pipeline, upgrade project materials to universal render pipeline, and there we go. Now in the universal render pipeline, it is going to be a little bit darker, and we will need to tweak that, but the next thing we need to do is just going to clean up all the assets in here, because we don't need a lot of this stuff. We don't need the tutorial info. We don't need the camera controller, but we will keep the scripts folder because we're going to use it ourselves. Scene, we don't need these, but we will use the scene folder when we make our own. Presets, we don't need any of these. Skybox will keep. Example assets we don't need either. And here we don't need the me file. So what we will do is save this scene as our FPS sandbox. And the next step to this is actually making it so that we can use the scene a bit more. so we can actually see what's going on, because at the moment, like I said, it's very dark in here. So we actually add some post-processing to make things a bit easier. So to do that, all we need to do is create an empty, and it's always good just to name this one post-processing. And in here we go to add component, volume, and then we're going to create a new profile, and this will generate for us. And to add any post-processing effects, we just need to do add override, and the first one that we're going to add is the color adjustment, because that's going to allow us to just tweak our exposure. For me, I'm just going to hit it to 2. Now, if you notice in our scene window, we are seeing it, the exposure increasing, but we're not seeing anything in our display window, in our game window. What we need to do is go to our main camera, and over here, enable post-processing. And now we can actually see what's going on. We will tweak this a little bit further with the post-processing, so that you can get more of a look like I did with the intro, or your own one, of course, but we'll leave that for a little bit later on. Now, one thing that this scene does take advantage of is the snaps tools, and you'll notice them up here in the left hand corner of your scene. And depending on if you used it before or not, there will be different settings when this is first imported. But one of the things that you may see is here, where you actually see the grid, this little grid in the scene, which can be just toggled on or off. Simply what that's doing is providing a grid of snap movement, and this one here needs to be clicked on for it to actually be working. When I do that, you'll see, as the name implies, it now moves around and snaps into position, which is a really fantastic tool when we go to doing other prototyping. But for the moment, we're just going to leave it back to normal, and we're going to switch all this off because we don't need it. The next thing that can be very useful is that we don't really want to interact with anything in the scene. So if we go into the hierarchy and we click on this folder here, which is all our scene, what we're going to do is actually click on this little icon here, which is the little hand, which means that we can no longer click on anything in the scene, which is going to make it very easy for when we actually are trying to move around our player once we've created it. So the next step obviously is to start creating our character and start giving him some functionality, him or her I should say. So creating our player, we're just going to right click into the hierarchy, and to start off with, just to give us a bit of a visual representation, we're just going to create a capsule, and we are going to reset him, which is probably going to put him just outside the box. Yes it is. So we're going to drag him in, double click on him so we know where he is, and I already know from past experience that we need to put this to 1, and we're going to drag him to this point in the room to make this our starting point. You can put him wherever you want yourself. For me, it's going to be here, just to line things up. And we're going to rename the capsule to player. Now, of course, being an FPS, all our view is going to be first person, which means from the view of the camera directly. So what we now need to do is click on our main camera. Click on the player, go to the transform, and go copy. Now, this is a new thing with 2021, is that you can actually copy individual components: rotation, scale, position, world. For us at the moment, we're just going to go with position world. Click on our main camera and paste position world. And now our camera's moved over to where our character is. Now, of course, our eyes aren't in the middle of our body, and this capsule is roughly 2 meters tall. So if we grab the camera component, and just drag it up to roughly where we would imagine the eyes are on our 2 meter character. It's a little bit tall, but I think that's fine. We can always scale that down later, but that's going to sit just about right. The next thing we need to do is child the camera to our player, so that when our player moves around, so will our camera. And you could actually keep the capsule here, not a problem, as a representation, but we actually really don't need it. And we definitely don't need the capsule collider. So that is the first thing we're going to do. We're just going to remove that component from our player. We will keep this capsule for the moment just so we can see him. Now, there are many different ways that we can go about actually moving our player around, but Unity provides us with functionality already. So we're going to go ahead and use that, and that's the character controller. So once again, with our player selected, we click on Add Component and search for Character Controller. So the very next thing we're going to do is create our script to interact with our character controller. So we're going to create a new script, and we're going to call this one Player Controller. Or actually, we'll name this Player Movement. And we just find our player and attach it to it so we don't forget. Double clicking, we open it up. Alright, so the first thing we do before we get started to any coding is we're actually going to type this out in pseudocode. And all pseudocode does is help us work out the logic of what we're doing and break down big tasks into smaller tasks. And this is great practice and something that you should always be doing, especially when you're first starting out. And so as a demonstration for this one, we've got the pseudocode. We always comment out what we're doing. So what's the first thing that we need to do? We're looking to move our player, and we're going to take in the WASD. So we're going to take in the WASD input. So get WASD input for player. And then what do we need to do with that? Move player based on WASD input. And then after we've moved player, we also want to be able to look around, because if you know any great FPS game, we always use the WASD or arrow keys and the mouse to look around. So same thing, get mouse position input. And look or aim based on mouse input. So now we've taken one big, huge, complex problem, which is moving the player and aiming, and we've broken it down into 4 separate ones. And depending on the complexity of it, of course, you can break it down further, but this will do for the moment for us. So the first one is the WASD input. So how do we go about doing that? Well, there's always a couple of different options, but for us, Unity has the input functions. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a float horizontal equals input dot get axes horizontal and same thing for our vertical input. And as of 2019, there is a new input system, but they've only just sort of ironing it out at the moment. And for anyone that's using whatever version, 2018, 2019, this system that we're going to be using now is tried and true and will work on all those those systems. And if you want to know what this is actually referring to here, the get axis input, if we jump back into Unity and we go up to edit project settings and you go to your input manager, you can see here, these are all the different input settings that we can use. And these are always going to be strings that you reference for. So as you can see here in Visual Studio, that's our inputs there. So horizontal and vertical. So this will give us a value of between -1 and 1 based on the input. So if we hit, for the vertical, if we hit W, it's going to give us a value of 1. And as we hit S, it's going to give us a value of -1. Well, actually, it won't give us 1 or -1 straight away. As you hold down the key longer, it will alert from 0 to 1 or 0 to -1. So now that we have those inputs, what do we do with them? Well, first thing that we're going to do is we need to combine these two values to give an input that we're going to give to the character controller. So I'm going to show you a little trick here. Now, I already know what the value is that we need to do with this, but just in case you don't, or working with this, what we can do is do a var move. We're going to call this movement. And what we need to do is we're going to do vector3 dot forward times our vertical. So using the vertical ones for our forward and backwards movement. So what this is doing, all movement is based around vector 3s. And the forward one is just giving us our forward vector from our player object, and then we're timesing it by the vertical input. So for instance, if we push the W key, it's going to be 1 times this, so it's going to give us a forward motion. And if it's we hit the S key, it's going to be the forward motion times -1, which is going to give the opposite, so the reverse of it. And then we also need to input our horizontal input. I know it's a lot of inputs. So then we need to add in our horizontal input, and we simply do the same thing. But this time I'm going to use vector3 dot right. Now you could use left, but you can then have to flip down the values. Just know that when you're doing it this way, vector3 dot right works better. Times horizontal. Now back to that little trick I was going to show you. Now I know, because we're adding vector 3s together, that the result is going to be a vector 3. And if we hover over the var function here, we can see that it's telling us it's going to give us back a vector 3. Struct Unity engine vector 3. But if there's something more complex going on here, or if we're using a function we're not quite sure what the output is, by using this it's going to automatically assign the correct variable type to our variable here. Now, one bad practice I see a lot of other programmers using is the fact that they will leave that var there. If this suddenly gets very long and complicated, you're not going to remember what this was, and you don't want to have to hover it over each time when you're trying to look through a script to determine what's going on. So once we do know what this actually is that it's provided for us, you should always just change it back to what's being provided. That way it becomes much easier to read anytime you come back to it. So now we've got our vector 3 movement. We need to add this to our character controller. Now, there are a couple of different ways that you can do this. A lot of people would start using get components right here, and that is the way that we do a good way of grabbing it, but you never want to be doing a get component call inside your update function, because that means you're going to be doing that every time, every frame, and get components are actually slightly expensive to use. So what we need to do is we actually need to cache that value. So what does that mean? So first thing we do up the top, we are going to declare it. So we go private character controller char controller. Now again, just a little bit of best practice here. All variables, unless for a specific reason, should be kept as private, which means only this class, this script here, can access it. The other thing is, if you're using a private variable, you should put a underscore beforehand, just to make it easier to know which ones are private functions and which ones are public just so you know which variables are private and which ones are not. So if this was going to be a public variable, I'd get rid of the underscore, but it's a private one, so we're going to put it here. Now we could serialize this and put it so that we can add it in, and honestly for prototyping that's not so bad, but just to show you how it should be done for practices, this is where we use our get component. So char controller equals get component character controller. Now another good practice is that we should always be checking to see if there actually was a character controller on there, and then we should throw a, and if there isn't one, we should then be throwing an error to let us know that there isn't one before we go any further. And the easiest way to do that is if char controller, whoops, equals null, debug.log, no character controller attached to player. Now there's also a way that we can go about enforcing the fact that there is a character controller on the player object, but we're not going to go into that far. But just know that that is something that you can do and can be quite advisable. So now that we have our character controller variable and we have cached it, and if you don't know what caching means, it just means that we're providing a reference to it for easier access. Now we need to update that character controller. So what do we want to do with the character controller? Well, the best thing to do is for us to look at the documentation for the character controller. And if you haven't looked at any documentation, it's a practice that you should really be getting into. And as if you're new to Unity or new to programming, documentation can be a little bit daunting at first and a little bit overwhelming, but there are going to be many times where there aren't going to be tutorials like this to tell you how to use it, or you're going to want to do something slightly different to what a tutorial or something you've read up has said. And so you need to be able to look at these things and understand what the documentation is doing and telling you. And once you get your head around it and you've looked at a few of them, it becomes a lot easier and a lot more understandable. You know what you're looking for. I'm not going to go into this one. I might do a video later on documentation and how to read it, but all you need to know in here, what we're looking for is the public methods. So these are the methods that we can use. And in this case, the one that we're looking for is quite aptly named move. So this tells us what to use. And if we click on the link, it's going to tell us what we're doing with this function, and it even gives us an example that we can work from. And you'll see that we're going to actually use this example quite a bit over the next couple of videos. We're not going to use it all today, we'll just use a part of it. And right up the top here, it tells us exactly how to use it, move, and provide a vector 3 for the motion. So going back to Visual Studio, we go character controller dot move, and what are we moving? We are moving by the movement. And if we save this, and push play, it's moving, but it's moving very, very fast. But at least we know it's working. So how can we fix that crazy movement? There's two different things that we want to add in here, and one of them is going to require a variable. But the first one we're going to do is timesing this by time.delta time. And if you don't know what time.delta time, all that's making sure is that no matter how fast your computer is or how slow it is, this is going to run relatively the same speed on every single computer. Or if you want, You can check out the documentation and have a read on it, and there's many other functions that time does, but delta time is the one we want to do it. Now if we save it and press play, we have movement, but we're very sluggish and very slow. So we need our own little variable here to be actually control that, which we're going to call speed. And this one, we're going to want it to be in our editor so that ourselves, or if there's anyone else working on the project, can change it and provide their own input to the player. So we're going to use a serialized field. I'm going to call this one, this is going to be a float underscore speed. And for the moment, we're going to give it a value of 7. And then all we do is times that by speed. And for anyone that's not familiar with serialized fields, now if we click on our player and we have a look at our player movement script, we can now see our speed and we can adjust this. So we're going to go, say, to 6. We push play. And now we have some slightly better speed and movement going on. And later on, we can use this for power-ups. If we want to give our player fast speed or run, we can use that speed variation to actually manipulate how fast we are going. So that's where we're going to leave it for this episode. We've already got a great start. We've created a scene using a free asset to help prototype what we're doing. We've already started to break down what we need to do for our player to get the movement going. And we've already got our player moving in a forwards and sideways direction. If you want to take a crack at the mouse look, you can do that as well. It will be using the input system, so have a look through the input properties and see if you can figure out, at the very least, see if you can figure out what we're going to be using on the next episode. Because a big part of programming is the fact that you need to solve problems. That's what a programmer is. We're a problem solver, and nothing's going to be handed to you. You're going to have to do a lot of research quite often, figure out problems. So see what you can do with this one. And next week we'll get into it and have the mouse look going and apply gravity as well, because you can see that's going to come into a bit of an issue when we start doing the stairs. And thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and share to help grow our beautiful Unity community. And don't forget to hit that subscribe and notification button below to make sure you get to see our next video. See you shortly.